Let me take you somewhere not with facts, not with numbers, but with truth. The kind of truth that's been earned, not borrowed, tested, not assumed, forged in fire, not crafted in air-conditioned rooms behind closed doors. They tried to break Iran, not once, not twice, but again and again. They sent storms of sanctions, waves of isolation, thunderclaps of threats. They struck from shadows with drones in the sky and cyber weapons in the wires. They whispered fear into markets and screamed chaos into the headlines. And yet, something didn't run. The people stood. The nation stood, not because they had more guns or greater gold, but because deep in their chest beat something greater, faith. The kind of faith you don't understand unless you've been through dark. The kind of faith that stands tall not when times are easy, but when the world turns cold and your back is against the wall. You see, power isn't always in the bombs you drop or the policies you sign. Real power, enduring power, lives in the soul of those who refuse to bow. And Iran, wounded as it has been, stands tall not because of might, but because of belief. When the world turned its back, Iran didn't beg, it built. When the lights went out, Iran lit candles and kept walking. When the doors closed, Iran found windows, dug tunnels, climbed walls. Faith, true faith, makes a nation inventive, makes a people bold. It doesn't shrink in the face of pressure, it grows. And while many saw only collapse beneath the surface, something else was happening. People were turning pain into perseverance. They were turning loss into legacy. They were turning pressure into purpose. The world thought Iran would fall. That's what history books prepare to write. But history doesn't bend to the pen of predictions. It bows to the ink of endurance. When they assassinated scientists, Iran responded not with panic, but with planning. When deals were broken, it didn't cry foul. It adapted. It pushed forward. That's the difference between survival and surrender. Survival finds a way, and faith is the compass that never loses direction. They froze assets, crippled trade, and demonized in every language known to man. But every time they pushed, Iran didn't just hold the line, it moved forward. Maybe slowly, maybe quietly, but forward nonetheless. You can crush the body, but you cannot chain the will. You can drop a bomb, but you can't destroy a people's memory. Iran remembers who it is. It remembers the poets, the prophets, the philosophers. It remembers the sound of call to prayer echoing across mountains, the fire of ancient kings, the courage of children who grew up too fast under a sky full of threats. It remembers, and in that memory it finds strength. They underestimated what it means to be rooted, deeply, unshakably rooted, in tradition, in faith, in family, in struggle. Iran doesn't stand on shifting sands, it stands on stone forged by centuries of resilience. And no matter how many missiles are launched, no matter how many alliances are formed against it, you can't bomb away belief. You can't sanction away spirit. You can't isolate the soul. There's a fire that burns in the hearts of those who have suffered and yet chosen not to hate, who have lost and yet chosen not to forget, who have wept and yet chosen not to quit. They thought Iran would quit. That's what they bet on. But faith doesn't gamble, it builds, brick by brick, prayer by prayer, generation by generation. It teaches fathers to raise sons with dignity. It teaches mothers to carry mountains on their backs and still sing lullabies at night. It teaches children to dream not of escape but of rebuilding. It teaches a nation not to kneel, not to whimper, not to waver. You want to know what Unbreakable looks like? It doesn't look like a tank. It looks like a grandmother on a rooftop during wartime, whispering prayers into the night. It looks like a teenager learning to code, not for profit, but for protection. It looks like a soldier standing guard, not for conquest, but for the love of the soil beneath his feet. Faith doesn't always wear robes. Sometimes it wears work clothes. Sometimes it bleeds. Sometimes it limps, but it never bows. Iran's story isn't one of domination, it's one of defiance. Not loud, boastful defiance. Quiet, steady, enduring defiance. A kind of spiritual endurance that can't be bought or taught. It must be lived. And Iran has lived through war, through embargo, through betrayal and isolation. And still, it walks forward. The ones who try to crush it, they don't understand that when you attack something that believes, you make it stronger. Every strike becomes a lesson. Every threat becomes a test. And Iran has passed test after test, not by retaliating with hate, but by responding with honor. That's what faith does. It restrains when you want to explode. It builds when it would be easier to burn. It endures when it would be simpler to give up. The story isn't over. It never really is. But let this be known. Those who thought they could erase a nation, erase its will, erase its hope, they were wrong. Because faith doesn't die in the dark. It shines brighter. They thought they could crush Iran, but faith built something stronger than fear, stronger than bullet, stronger than sanctions. Faith built a nation that does not kneel. It only rises again and again and again and again. Let me speak clearly and let these words land not in your ears but in your soul. A nation that bleeds learns how to heal, but a nation that boasts forgets how to rise. Iran has bled. Yes, the soil of that land has soaked in the tears of widows, the sweat of laborers, the blood of martyrs, but every wound carved into its earth has become a root, deep, unshakable, alive. You can look into the history of this nation and trace it through pain, but you will also trace it through strength, through every air raid siren that once screamed through Tehran, through every child that grew up too soon under the shadow of war, through every mother that sent her son to the front lines with a kiss and a prayer. There lies the heartbeat of a people who would not bow. They lost lives, they lost years, they lost comfort, but they never lost identity. They never lost the map to who they were. And when a people remember who they are, they can never be conquered. You see, the world saw weakness in their struggles, but it missed the wisdom in their silence. It misread the humility as surrender. It mistook patience for passivity. But beneath the silence was resolve. And beneath that resolve was a faith so deeply woven into the fabric of Iranian life, it could not be pulled apart, not by threats, not by poverty, not even by fear. Every attempt to break them only forced them to find new strength. They learned to adapt, to grow in the cracks, to breathe even when the air was thick with hostility. They learned that their faith was not just religion. It was rhythm, it was memory, it was the breath of every grandmother reciting prayers in the dark. It was the strength in every farmer who worked the land even when crops dried. It was the pulse of every child who walked to school under the weight of sanctions, but carried in their eyes the promise of tomorrow. The world judged them by the battles they lost, but God remembered the spirit they never gave up. When they were pushed into the corner, they did not claw like animals, they stood like lions, silent, watchful, unafraid. They knew their struggle wasn't just about oil or power or politics. It was about dignity, and dignity cannot be traded or taken. It must be lived. And they lived it every single day, in the markets, in the mosques, in the mountains. Dignity walked with them, slept beside them, ate at their table. It was in the poetry they still read, in the traditions they still honored, in the love they still gave, despite everything. Let me tell you what they did not do. They did not kneel. They did not curse the sky or blame the world. They endured. With quiet fire, with unshakable purpose. They took each insult and each injury and wove it into a flag that refused to fall. Because to them, faith was not something to hold on to when things were easy. It was something to hold on to when everything else was taken. It was the one thing no drone could destroy, no embargo could steal. It was passed from grandfather to grandson, from teacher to student, from the old to the young like a torch in the night. And while the world looked away, waiting for collapse, Iran built. In silence, in shadows, in struggle, it built. Schools kept teaching. Scientists kept working. Artists kept creating. Mosques kept praying. Families kept dreaming. And that right there is the true miracle. Not that they survived, but that they kept living with purpose. Because that's what separates a people from a crowd. That's what turns suffering into sacredness. They didn't just wait for better days. They prepared for them. They didn't just wish for relief. They earned it with their endurance. And though they have carried more than their fair share of burdens, they have never asked for pity, only for the right to walk upright, with their history intact and their pride unbroken. You want to know what true resistance looks like? It's not just soldiers on the front lines. It's the mother who cooks with less but feeds her children with joy. It's the father who cannot find work but still teaches his son how to pray. It's the child who dreams of becoming a doctor, not to leave the country, but to heal it. That is resistance. That is courage. That is the legacy of a people who refuse to kneel. They have stood while others expected them to fall. They have laughed when others waited for tears. They have built when others sent bombs. And though their buildings may crack and their cities may be scarred, their will is untouched, untamed, unbroken. Because it was never made in the comfort of peace. It was made in the fire of pain. And fire has a way of purifying what it touches. Iran's fire has burned away the excess, the superficial, the distraction. And so today, when you look at Iran, don't just see the headlines, look deeper. See the resilience beneath the surface. See the ancient spirit walking with modern feet. See a people who do not flinch, who do not retreat, who do not forget. They are not perfect, but they are proud. They are not the wealthiest, but they are rich in soul. They are not the strongest by weaponry, but by will. They are unmatched. And will, my friend, will is the one weapon you cannot confiscate. So let the world judge. Let the critics speak. Let the powers continue their games. Iran will endure. Because they have something the world can't calculate, something it can't contain. They have faith, not the kind that folds in hard times, but the kind that hard times can't break. And that kind of faith doesn't just build homes. It builds nations. It builds a future. It builds a promise that though they may bleed, they will never bow. Not now, not ever. The world watches like a crowd in a coliseum, waiting for the moment the warrior falls. Eyes fixed, hands clenched, voices hushed. They want to see the collapse. They want to see the story end in defeat. Iran was supposed to be that spectacle, that crumbling monument of resistance. The news was ready. The cameras were rolling. They thought the end was near. That pressure would bring surrender. That isolation would bring weakness. That broken treaties, assassinations, and economic strangulation would bring this ancient nation to its knees. But history is not written by those who wait to see others fall. History is written by those who refuse to fall. And Iran, despite everything it has endured, has refused. They called it a rogue state. They labeled it with threats. They cast it aside. But every label, every accusation, every attempt to marginalize it only reminded the people of their purpose. You don't write off a civilization that's seen empires rise and crumble. You don't dismiss a people whose roots stretch back to the cradle of history. You may mock them, isolate them, even try to erase them, but they remain, because they know who they are. Because they are anchored not in temporary trends, but in timeless truth. And in that silence where the world expected to hear the sound of surrender, something else was heard, the quiet hum of rebuilding, the whisper of progress, the rhythm of resilience. Iran didn't shout back. It didn't scream for attention. It didn't demand pity. Instead, it went to work, quietly, steadily, with the hands of its engineers, its teachers, its farmers, its youth. The kind of building you don't see in headlines, but you see in homes, in classrooms, in laboratories, in prayer rooms. They build not just structures, but spirit, not just systems, but soul. Because faith doesn't wait for a miracle, it becomes one. And faith doesn't follow the world's script, it rewrites it. Doesn't collapse when the pressure rises, it becomes diamond. While sanctions tried to choke the economy, Iran turned inward. It trained its own, it invented, it innovated. It looked to the past not for nostalgia, but for wisdom. It remembered how its forefathers survived droughts, invasions, occupations. They taught themselves to breathe in smoke and still speak truth. To walk through fire and still carry dignity. That's what the world didn't understand. It thought Iran would measure success by international approval, that its value came from alliances and handshakes. But Iran looked to something deeper, something more enduring. It looked to its faith, and that faith taught them that true strength is not in how the world sees you, but in how you see yourself when the world looks away. And the world did look away. It turned its back and waited for the end. But while the spotlight moved elsewhere, Iran stood in the shadows and found power there. Because faith doesn't need applause, it needs resolve. And resolve, once earned, cannot be bought or borrowed. It becomes a fire that no wind can extinguish. They lit that fire in their homes, in their hearts, and they kept walking. Not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. Because survival was not an option. It was an obligation to their ancestors, to their children, to their history. And now that fire burns brighter than ever. You can feel it in the steps of the youth marching forward with ideas that once seemed impossible. You can hear it in the voices of poets whose words carry more weight than bullets. You can see it in the resolve of families who plant trees knowing they may never sit under their shade, but their grandchildren will. That is the kind of strength no empire can manufacture, the kind of courage no enemy can calculate. And yet the world still doubts, still watches, still waits. But while it waits, Iran keeps moving, quietly defiant, unapologetically faithful, fiercely proud. The headline said collapse. The reality said resurrection. And now, even those who doubted are beginning to ask, how did they survive? How did they endure? The answer is not in strategy, not in wealth, not in weapons. It's in faith. A faith that tells them, you are more than what they call you. You are not defined by what they take from you. You are defined by what you protect, what you nurture, what you refuse to give up. And that is a powerful thing. That is a dangerous thing to those who thrive on fear, because a nation that fears nothing, not even death, cannot be controlled. So the world watches, but it watches in confusion now, because what was supposed to fall rose, what was supposed to be broken healed, what was supposed to be buried bloomed, and still Iran doesn't gloat, it doesn't boast, it simply continues, like a river beneath the surface, like a heartbeat that never stops. That is the mark of faith. It does not need to shout to be heard. It does not need to shine to be seen. It just needs to keep going. And now the very nations that once predicted Iran's downfall are beginning to whisper new questions. They're beginning to look again, not with scorn, but with awe. Not with arrogance, but with respect. Because they're beginning to understand this was never about politics. It was about principle. It was about a people who chose faith over fear, who chose dignity over comfort, who chose to rise instead of kneel. Let that be the lesson. Let that be the echo that rings across every courtroom, every war room, every newsroom. That faith is not weakness. That silence is not surrender. That patience is not defeat. And that the ones you thought would fall might just be the ones who lead, because they have something more than strategy. They have soul, and soul, when it is rooted in faith, can outlast storms, outlive enemies, and outshine darkness. So they tried to crush Iran. They thought it would be the end, but the end didn't come. Instead, a new chapter began, a chapter not written by fear, but by faith. Not forged by power, but by purpose. And now, as the dust settles and the world looks on, one truth stands tall. You can try to break a body, but you cannot kill a spirit built on faith. And that is why Iran stands today. Not just as a nation, but as a reminder. A living, breathing reminder that faith builds more than temples and monuments. It builds nations, it builds futures, it builds legacies that do not kneel.